Hi, this is Dr. Scott Jensen, and today I think it's important to review and discuss an article co-authored by Dr. Tony Fauci, and what's really important about it is that he finally asks the million-dollar question. So in order to understand what I'm going to be sharing with you today, I think you need to understand one phrase: respiratory mucosa. What is the respiratory mucosa? Well, the respiratory mucosa is the thin lining of the nasal passageway, the pharynx, the trachea, and then the bronchial tubes. So these passageways through our nose, down our throat, into our voice box, that's respiratory mucosa. That's really important to what Dr. Fauci and his colleagues share in this article. And this article is in the journal Cell, Host, and Microbe. If you put in your Google box, rethinking next generation vaccines, you'll pop up this article. I just checked it out. The article was written less than a month ago. I believe it was January 11th, 2023. It was written before that, but that's when it was released on this journal. So anyway, here's what David Morens, Jeffrey Taubenberger, and Anthony Fauci say. And there's a summary right here, and I want to talk about the summary. They say this: viruses that replicate in the human respiratory mucosa, that's in our nose, our pharynx, trachea, and bronchial tubes. Viruses that replicate or duplicate or do their mischief in the respiratory mucosa without infecting systemically, meaning they don't necessarily get into the bloodstream. How can we tell the difference between that? We could culture the respiratory mucosa and grow the virus, but if we culture the blood, we have difficulty growing that virus out. But anyway, so viruses that replicate in the respiratory mucosa, and then he identifies three of them: influenza, COVID-19, other coronaviruses, but then RSV. And he also references many common cold viruses. Anyway, he said these viruses cause significant mortality and morbidity, a lot of death, a lot of disease, and are important public health outcomes. Because these viruses generally do not elicit complete and durable protective immunity by themselves, they have not to date been effectively controlled by licensed or experimental vaccines. So he's acknowledging that influenza, COVID-19, RSV, common cold viruses have not been effectively controlled by licensed or experimental vaccines. Have not been effectively controlled. He acknowledges that. He says these viruses replicate very rapidly on the surface epithelium, that respiratory mucosa, that lining, and they are quickly transmitted to other hosts. So in other words, these viruses get into our respiratory tree, our nose, our pharynx, our brain, our trachea, and bronchial tubes, and really, before they get into the bloodstream where our immune system can recognize them, they're already replicating and they're being dispatched to other people. That's important. This article is a long article, but there's a lot of good stuff in it. Then he goes on and says, surprisingly, and he's talking about the flu vaccine now, surprisingly, little has changed with influenza vaccines since 1957, when they were first administered in U.S. national vaccination programs. So literally, we're talking 60 years almost. We are talking 60 years. Although current influenza vaccines reduce the risk of severe disease, hospitalization, and death to some degree, he says, their effectiveness against clinically apparent infection is decidedly suboptimal, ranging from 14% only to 60% over the past 15 influenza seasons. Furthermore, the duration of vaccine-elicited immunity is measured only in months. In other words, whatever immunity you get from the influenza vaccine is only months long. Well, I think you need to understand that what does vaccine effectiveness, how does that get measured? Let's say that he says it's anywhere from 14 to 60%. Let's say that the flu vaccine is, we'll take a number between 14 and 60, we'll take 33, 1/3. What that tells you is that it doesn't say that the vaccine will work only 33% of the time. What it tells you is that in a vaccinated population, 33% fewer people will contract the disease. when they come in contact with the virus. So let's take an example. Let's just look at a country like America. Let's just say that we've got 150 million people who get the flu vaccine, and we have 150 million who don't. And we'll say that the vaccine is 33% effective. Typically, we can't calculate that until after the flu season's over. But if we have 150 million people that did not get vaccinated and 150 million people that did, and the typical year in America, 5 to 20% of people will come down with the flu. So let's just take 10%. So we've got 150 million people. 10% of them will come down with the flu. So out of that 150 million unvaccinated people, 15,000 people will get the flu. Okay, what a 33% vaccine effective rate tells us is in that 150 million vaccinated people, 33% fewer people will be infected with the flu. That would mean we have 15 million people with the flu in this group. 33% of that is 5 million. 15 million take away 5 million is 10 million. So in that given year situation, 15 million unvaccinated people would get the flu. 10 million vaccinated people would get the flu. So if you look at the big number, you have 150 million people being vaccinated, and that group will benefit by having a total of 5 million less influenza cases. So you can understand now that vaccine effectiveness, when it's only 33%, it may not have as big a difference as we'd like. So then Fauci and the co-authors say this: as of 2022, after more than 60 years of experience with flu vaccines, very little improvement in vaccine prevention of infection has been noted. Pretty dismal words. Then he goes on to say this: however, as COVID-19 strains have emerged, deficiencies in these vaccines reminiscent of influenza vaccines have become apparent. Deficiencies in the COVID-19 vaccines cause one to think of the influenza vaccines. The vaccines for these two very different viruses have common characteristics, both the COVID-19 and the influenza. They elicit incomplete and short-lived protection against evolving virus variants that escape population immunity. Then he goes on to say this: more than a half a century ago, the development of successful vaccines against some of the most important respiratory viruses, measles, mumps, and rubella, led to the hope that vaccines could soon be developed for all other respiratory infections. However, natural infections with these three vaccine-controlled respiratory viruses, measles, mumps, and rubella, are not representative of infections caused by most respiratory viruses. They differ in three critical ways. So what they're really doing is they're saying measles, mumps, and rubella on one hand is different than influenza and COVID-19 on the other. And he said these are three critically important ways in which they differ. Number one, measles, mumps, and rubella all cause significant viremia. Viremia means the virus gets in the blood. Emia means blood. So the virus gets in the blood. That's not what happens with flu and COVID-19. There, it gets hung up on the respiratory mucosa, replicates there. And before our immune system really gets a chance to read this, the person with the influenza or COVID-19 is already spewing it to other people. So number one, these systemic respiratory viruses that have responded to vaccines, measles, mumps, and rubella, all cause significant viremia. The virus gets in the blood. That allows multiple immune compartments in our body to interface, allowing us to have T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes and macrophages and create antibodies and have plasma cells develop. All of that stuff happens when the virus gets in the blood. But with COVID-19 and influenza, it likes to hang up on that respiratory mucosa. Second thing, they have relatively long incubation periods, measles, mumps, and rubella do, compared to influenza and COVID-19. And thirdly, they elicit, measles, mumps, and rubella elicits long-term or lifetime protective immunity. That's why if you're born before 1957, you don't even have to prove that you've ever gotten a measles shot, because you have lifelong immunity and virtually everybody got it. I was born before 1957. What's the incubation period of measles, mumps, and rubella? Measles, 10 days, maybe a little longer. Mumps, 16 days. Rubella, 16 days. Long immunity. Infection elicits long-term protection. What about coronaviruses? 5 days, maybe less in terms of incubation period. Influenza, 2 days. Para-influenza, 4 days. What is an incubation period? That's the interval of time from when you got exposed to when you started to show symptoms or signs. So it's sort of the quiet period. You got exposed to someone on an airplane, in a movie theater, wherever. How many days later did you start to show signs or symptoms? With measles, it'll be 10 days. Mumps, more than 2 weeks. Influenza, maybe 48 hours. The length of the incubation period matters. So Fauci and the authors go on to say this: viruses such as influenza, COVID-19, and RSV tend to have significantly shorter incubation periods. They replicate, duplicate, if you will, hijack the cells, predominantly in local mucosa tissue. That's the nose, pharynx, trachea, and bronchial tubes, without causing viremia, without allowing our immune system to really get the good look at all the various antigens on the virus that would allow us to create antibodies. For instance, I've got antibodies in my blood against COVID-19 to the spike protein, but also the nucleocapsid, which is the envelope around the viral RNA. I've gotten that because I had the disease, and my immune system reacted to multiple parts of the COVID virus. Basically, it says this: influenza, COVID-19 replicate in the local mucosal tissue, the respiratory mucosa, without causing viremia, and they do not significantly encounter the systemic immune system or the full force of our adaptive immune responses. That's a huge difference from measles, mumps, and rubella. Goes on to say, the non-systemically replicating respiratory viruses include COVID-19, and these tend to repeatedly reinfect people over their lifetimes without ever eliciting complete and durable protection. And here's the rub. Here's the big question. This observation raises a question of fundamental importance. If natural mucosal respiratory viral infections, such as COVID-19 and influenza, do not elicit complete and long-term protective immunity against reinfection, how can we expect vaccines, especially systemically administered non-replicating vaccines, to do so? That's the question. This observation raises a question of fundamental importance. If natural mucosal respiratory viral infections, such as COVID-19 and influenza, do not elicit complete and long-term protective immunity against reinfection, how can we expect vaccines to do so? How can we expect vaccines, especially systemically administered non-replicating vaccines? In other words, the vaccine we're using isn't going in and replicating in our blood. How can we expect those vaccines to provide complete and long-term protective immunity? Isn't that what the American people were told? Weren't they told that get vaccinated and you're not just protecting yourself, you're protecting others too? You won't infect them. You won't transmit against them. You don't have to wear a mask. You don't have to participate in lockdowns. You don't have to participate in social distancing because you have immunity. This is where the trust went wrong. Tony Fauci, in this article, and I would recommend it to you, Tony Fauci and his co-authors come out and ask the question, how could we expect vaccines to do that which we told you to do? Isn't that really what they're saying? Is how could we expect vaccines to do that which we might have led you to believe they could do? I think that's the question of the day. I think that's why you're seeing leaders around the world say, we got to stop. That's why a Japanese professor is suing the government to stop. That's why Dr. Paul Offit is saying he doesn't see a rationale for boosters in kids and maybe a larger population segment than that. That's why we're seeing Dr. Levy from MIT say, stop the program. That's why we're seeing Dr. Asim Malhotra out of United Kingdom say, stop the program. Tony Fauci's saying it right here. He's acknowledging it. He's saying, if natural mucosal respiratory viral infections do not elicit complete and long-term protective immunity against reinfection, how can we expect vaccines to do so? Think about that. Thank you.